And so, as writers, or potential writers, as the case may be here, we're always kind of looking for a secret, and we're looking for a way to make our writing easier or more pleasurable for us. And this is where you come up against a problem. It's best expressed by an English playwright by the name of W. Somerset Maugham, who once said, "Writing's really easy," he said. There's only 3 rules to writing. The problem is no one can figure out what those 3 rules are. It changes. It's variant depending on who you are and what you want to explore. And for all writers, some love the challenge of facing that blank page, while others, it's like pulling your own teeth through your ear. It can be difficult. For some, the process, the actual, when you're in the process, is the most pleasurable part. While for others, and I kind of fall into the Stephen King school, and Stephen King said that the most pleasurable part, he was talking about novels, he said the most pleasurable part of writing a novel is being finished when I can reward myself with 6 weeks to recuperate. For me, of all of these tools, the tool that I find most interesting and valuable in my writing is the research process, because it's a treasure hunt. But there are pitfalls, and there are things you have to look for as you do research for whatever genre you write about. So what I'd like to do today is to tell you some of my thoughts about why I think that research is valuable, and then, in the second part of my presentation, to take you through a little tour of resources that are available to you for research that you may find valuable for historical research or cultural research or the writing process or the publishing process, and a whole variety of ways that are available to you online. So I want to go through that and give you some examples. But let's start with research itself. And if you'll excuse me, I have a bad back, and I'm going to have to sit for most of this. I hope that's okay with you. But let's start with my favorite part of the writing process, which is this research discovery. And it's the discovery of the new, and even the merely useful can be rewarding and pretty exciting when it's truly something unique, something that's been hidden for a long time. And regardless of the genre you're in, your writing should, I think, have a component of research. If you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing historical fiction, or if you're writing poetry or prose, if you're doing something that's even totally stream of consciousness or fantasy, there's going to be an element where you make a reference or you want to drive the plot in some way in which you're going to have to do some research. And this is what makes research valuable, regardless of genre. No matter what you approach, something is going to require you to do research. And this is where I'm going to be talking about some of the pitfalls to look for. Even something, perhaps you're writing a story about living on the edge of the universe and where all of the rules of physics are turned upside down. It's a great premise, but you also have to know what the rules of physics are in the actual world, so you have a way to compare and contrast it. This is why research can be valuable to you. Let's go through some of the reasons why. First of all, readers have expectations. When you write something, they expect you to demonstrate some competence in the subject. You don't have to be an expert, although it's nice if you are, but readers are willing, even eager, to suspend disbelief if it appears that you appear to know what you're writing about. So if you make a reference in your writing, is it suitable? Does it fit with the flow of your theme? Is it accurate? Because readers have this expectation that you have competence in your subject. And believe me, I know this from my personal experience. If you don't get it quite right, they let you know. They definitely let you know. And so research provides this expectation for readers. Research can provide context and texture and flavor and consistency as well. That not only are you demonstrating that you know what you're talking about, but it provides context. Your world, whatever your world is, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, prose, poetry, plays, whatever it may be, your world is more credible if you provide what actors call a backstory. If you can present your material so that it seems grounded in reality, it makes a difference. It provides texture too. Pam was talking about this in her keynote, about the landscape of your writing is fuller and richer. Details can matter. A detail can add kind of an extra spice that can elevate your writing above the simply functional and make it more tasty and provide the surprises that Pam was talking about too. It's more satisfying for the reader. This is a reader's expectation too. You can talk about a subject, but you also have to make it a story and make it exciting and make it something that's going to spark their interest. I write mostly nonfiction, historical research, and one of the things that can be difficult is an order in your research to get a point across if you're dealing with a historic theme, is that sometimes you have to slog through the not very interesting to get to it. Well, there's a way to take this material and bring it to life. Your writing skill will do this, and also by carefully taking a look at what the research can provide to you and not just assuming that it's going to be deadly dull. Because lots of times it's not going to be. What may appear dull is actually quite fascinating. And there's consistency too as part of this research process. If you're writing something historical fiction or you make an allusion to something classical, for instance, in a poem, is it consistent with the time? If you write a novel and you're doing, say it's the 19th century in America, are the characters dressed right? Is the language correct? Is the terminology proper? Is the scientific principles appropriate for the time? And even in an invented world, is there a consistency in the theme and the language and the attitude? I think a classic example of this is Alice in Wonderland. I mean, falling down a rabbit hole and finding a new wonderful world is unlikely. But we are drawn in because Lewis Carroll believes it. The reader is drawn in because there's a confidence and a consistency in his vision. And the created world is plausible, even though it's not actually real. And readers expect that. And again, they will let you know if you're not. When you make this research journey, there are discoveries that will be made. Pam was talking about surprises in writing. Well, there are surprises in research too. Research discovery can spur new ideas and put you in new approaches and new directions. This is particularly true in historical research, because when you do this, you will find that there are many different stories for the same event. And there are different perceptions and different interpretations that people bring to the table because of their differences in political views or their gender or their age or their, whether they're rich or poor. People see the same event differently. This happens too in research, that if you get to a certain point, you start finding in the research that something is taking you in a different direction. That what you expected is not reality. I think you should hope for that. I think you should expect it and embrace it. There's a realization that your story can be enhanced by these discoveries you make. It may be frustrating. You may be writing along and you say, I'm headed toward this goal, but the next thing you find is a new research development, a new discovery that you found is pushing you in a different and potentially and usually more interesting direction. When you start to write, there's some points to consider. And one of the points to consider is consider the source. Whatever research you do, realize that you're dealing with human beings. And humans are not machines. We're not databases. And we're influenced by our personal experiences, our prejudices, our trauma, our political viewpoints. And keep in mind that when you research, these different viewpoints on the same subject is very, very common. And when you deal with any time period, whether it's contemporary, the contemporary world or anything in the ancient world, even in the worlds you invent, there's going to be things that are going to be different. Characters will see things differently. The world will be viewed in a different way. What I would recommend to you is, as you go through the source material, just choose wisely, realize that you're going to discover things that are going to surprise you, and also you're going to realize that very frequently you will find that there are contradictions and that there are errors. It's better to over-research. If you get into a topic, it's better to go more into detail in terms of your research effort than just to accept the common knowledge or to only go very skin-deep kind of a dive into this. Which leads to a couple of very important factors when you do any kind of research. One is you have to be careful. Sometimes what you discover in your research can throw off the direction of your narrative completely because you find out that the source you may have relied upon, or sources you relied upon, are wrong. This happens a lot in historical research, in which the facts are fabricated, there's typos. What happens, I can vouch for this, and anyone who's done any kind of historical research can vouch for this. Something gets quoted in a book 200 years ago, and 200 years ago it was an error. It's misspelled, or there's a typo, or they left out a word that changes the whole meaning. But that error keeps compounding through time because other researchers and writers see that entry and they feel it's so old it's got to be right. And you keep seeing it over and over and over again. This happens very commonly. It becomes a chain that becomes accepted as truth. And the same can happen, and often does happen, with a mistaken transcription or some misattribution or some other error. And, there's always good intentions. Nobody wants to make a mistake. But sometimes there's a printer's error or a mistake that somehow becomes a fact. So you have to be careful, and you have to be redundant and go through and see if you can find additional material to verify it. Let me give you an example. You probably all heard Mark Twain is attributed for saying this, that there was a rumor that he had died. I'm sure you know this story. There was a rumor that he had died, and he is said to have said, "The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." You've heard that story? And it's often resurfaces when there's an erroneous account of a celebrity passing away, for instance. Here's the problem with that. Mark Twain never said that. It sounds very Mark Twainish, but he never said that. He said something quite different. The actual case was that he had a cousin named James Clemens who was living in London. And his cousin got very seriously ill and was near death. And so a report came out in the newspaper that James Clemens, cousin of Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, was near death, very, very ill. Well, this got taken by other newspapers and other sources to where Clemens is near death, Sam Clemens is near death, Mark Twain is nearly dead. And then it becomes Mark Twain dies. Mark Twain got wind of these stories and he wrote to the newspaper in which he said the following: "James Ross Clemens, a cousin of mine, was seriously ill 2 or 3 weeks ago in London, but is well now. The report of my illness grew out of his illness. The report of my death was an exaggeration." It's very different from a flippant, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." It's different. And you find this where the tone and the attitude of the source has to be explored some. That leads to being skeptical. You just can't assume that something is true because you saw it in print. I teach history classes here at Sierra College. I wish I had a nickel for every time I've said to students, don't trust Wikipedia. Because it's inaccurate. Anybody can put anything onto it. And so you have to be skeptical. You might see something that's repeated in many different sources, but originally, the original source is wrong. So it's a rule of thumb among historical researchers in particular, to never put anything in print unless you verify the original source. And to go back and see if you can find out exactly what was said, what the original was. And so, just to be more verified. Just don't assume that because somebody published it, a prominent name, that it's correct. So you have to be a little bit skeptical. And fortunately, what's great today is we have resources because of online digitization that make that a whole lot easier to verify something. And so in this process, be careful what you look at. Be skeptical. Take the extra step in order to make sure that what you're using is what you really want to have, and it's correct, it's accurate. It makes a difference in your writing. It pushes you in the right direction for how you want to address your issue. It's more accurate. Readers have expectations that are fulfilled, and it provides this cushion and envelope and blanket of information that gives you more comfort that what you're writing is really where you want to go. It can take some effort, and looking for this material can take some time, but it all pays off in the end. There's a couple other things too, and then I'll start looking at some of the resources. When you do the research, it's okay to use creative license, as long as it's based on something that's real, as long as it's based on something that you're comfortable is expressing what you want to express and has a grounding in reality. If you're writing fiction, in particular, don't be afraid to use a basis of reality in the research in order to tell your story. The story should feel authentic. It doesn't necessarily have to be authentic. This is, I think, the classic story of this. There was, during the mid-1800s, a very common practice of people being buried with what were called safety coffins, because people would go into comas or narcolepsy, and they thought people were dead, and they weren't, and they would be buried alive. Edgar Allan Poe, one of the very first things he ever wrote was about being buried alive. And so there were actual safety coffins with bells you rang and breakable glass so you could break out and dig your way to safety. That was real. Well, there is a story that comes from this that is mentioned in legitimate, serious medical encyclopedias to this day about an Englishman named George Bateson who made a fortune selling safety coffins, that he was knighted by Queen Victoria, but he was so daily consumed with this issue of death that he started to become very morose, very unhappy, and finally he couldn't stand it anymore, and he doused himself with gasoline and committed suicide. It's all based in a real situation, which is safety coffins. George Bateson didn't exist. That never happened. It was part of a novel written by Michael Crichton called The Great Train Robbery, in which he took a real deal, safety coffins, and told the story of George Bateson. Sounds very authentic, but it isn't. And so you can use that creative license because it's based upon a real situation. And one thing that's for research is you don't have to use it all. Just because you do the research doesn't mean you have to use it all. It can give you comfort. It can give you an idea of what the world you're trying to create is creating. Use what you think is appropriate. Over-research. Have that comfort zone where what you're writing about has a feeling of authenticity, or is authentic if you're reading nonfiction. You can list all the research. You can do that, but that's not writing. That's just putting together a list. Use it in order to tell the story. And this research should serve the story, not vice versa. Research can be very powerful and important, but it should be to serve the story or the poem or the play, not vice versa. I think good writing demonstrates your ability to research, but more importantly, to use that research to enhance and to flesh out the story and to give it life. The actual nuts and bolts should be kind of as invisible as possible. Put together a scenario where you have enveloped yourself with so much information that the end product is going to feel real and authentic and genuine, and the readers are going to be fulfilled. I once talked to a writer just years ago about this process, about historical research, and she the way she explained it to me has always stuck with me. She said, when you do the research on a subject, envelop yourself with all this information. It is like a butterfly. And a butterfly is in a cocoon, and this cocoon nurtures the butterfly. And then the final product is the butterfly. Aspire to be the butterfly when you do this research. Use it to aid the story and to make it a stronger, more potent experience by you making the effort to get all of the grounding right, the foundation right. That's why I think research has value for whatever genre you're writing about. I want to stop for a second, see if there's any questions before I start going into some of these sources. No? Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of the sources that are available to you. And I'm going to bring up a couple of them and give you some examples of what you can find. First of all, there's lots and lots and lots of online books and journals now. One thing that's very, very good in the last 20 years or so with the information technology revolution is a lot of material that before you could only find in a library, hard copies, is now available because it's all digitized. And it's great, and most of the time it's searchable. And so you can find information much more readily today. If you're kind of old school like me, you kind of like to go and take a look at the books and get that old book smell and all that kind of stuff. But it's available, and it makes research a lot easier. So here's some examples of it. The University of Pennsylvania has an online book page in which there are hundreds, I think it's probably thousands now, of online books. Oftentimes it's fiction, but it's also nonfiction that are available to you. There's a project I didn't put up here called the Gutenberg Project, which has digital copies of books. The text, it's pretty generic. It's like rich text, but it's available to you and you can find it. There's an archive.org, which is a great resource, which provides you written materials, but also films and plays and imagery that can be very helpful too. If you're doing anything with California, I would recommend the Library of Congress's, if anything in the 19th century in California. It's called California as I Saw It. And it's hundreds of documents about California, both fiction and nonfiction, related to life in the 19th century in California. It's all searchable. It gives you the citations. It does a lot of the work for you. And as these things go, digitization can be sometimes a little bit problematic because they use OCR, optical character recognition. Sometimes it can be kind of glitchy, but the Library of Congress is very careful And so the source material you get from them is very accurate. And there are some others here like JSTOR, which if you're a Sierra College student or you have access through Sierra College as an instructor, JSTOR is free. If you do it privately, it costs you to research stuff. But it's incredible. It's a database of hundreds of thousands of source materials that can find you information pretty quickly. There's one on the bottom here. I want to show you about it here. It's called the HathiTrust. And this is relatively new. How come this isn't showing here? Doggone it. Okay. Let's try this here. Shoot. There we go. Okay. Technology. The HathiTrust is a digitization project that has been growing by leaps and bounds over the last 10 years or so. There are currently, I checked the numbers this morning, there are currently 18 million volumes in the HathiTrust that they have digitized. And it's not just the text, it's the actual physical document. And this can be very, very useful to you if you're looking for one issue or person or event to go back to the original documents, and it goes back into the 16th century. So I want to, just to give you an example of this, I write a lot about 19th century California. And in my research, I came across, make sure I spell this correct, Arifodina. I came across what is considered to be the first time travel novel. And it takes place in California in 1849. See the name of the author here? Can Tell a Big Lie. His actual name was George Washington Peck. He was somebody who, there we go, who never came to California, but wrote about time travel in the gold fields. And here, this is the kind of thing you get with the HathiTrust, is you get the actual document, and it's searchable as well. And so, this is an example of what you can get. Magazines, old journals, there are some newspapers. I'm going to show you another resource for newspapers in a minute, but it's a very rich resource. It's totally free, and it's a great resource for any kind of research because you can not only enter a specific thing like this, but you can enter a general theme, and it will bring up documents that deal with it. It's a really wonderful way to find material quickly. So that's an example of the one thing that's available to you. Okay, let me move on here. Boy, this is being difficult for me. There are, of course, libraries. Since we're here locally, there are a number of libraries. Every library in our region has a specialty, something that is particularly good on. The Roseville Library, for instance, for Placer County is really good on railroad stuff. If you go to Sac State or the Shields Library at Davis, they're comprehensive university libraries, so it's a lot more information that's available to you. If you want, what you will find, particularly depending on how far back your research is going, what you will find is there's a lot of stuff that's digitized now, but there's a lot of older materials that you would find useful that are only available in hard copy. And so the libraries still have a great deal of value in what we're doing. And there's a number of resources that you may not have thought of using that are particularly helpful. And one of them is the California State Library. California State Library, a lot of people think this imposing building here is a private research library. It's not. We all pay for it. We all can utilize it. I used to be on the State Library Foundation board, and so I have great respect for what they do there. And it is a place where you can do research that is really extensive and not just California-based. And what's particularly good about the California State Library is they will help you. It's the most helpful staff in a library I've ever encountered. And I've done stuff all over the country in the National Archives in Washington as well. Amazing. They're just amazing. And they will bring you out documents that you probably shouldn't be looking at or handling, but they do it because they're very helpful. And so I would urge you to do. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing you can find. Let me back up here. This is being really a pain here. Oh, darn it. Shoot. This is the problem when you get something set up and it doesn't work the way you want it to work. Doggone it. Okay, well. I'm sorry, I apologize for this. I'm just going to have to tell you, I guess. Doggone it. Here at the California State Library, it has a resource under collections. You see this on the right here. And under collections, they have all kinds of resources, but in particularly helpful is the one that says online catalogs here. And online catalogs take you to the entire resource of the California State Library in terms of pictures, in terms of documents, in terms of books, articles, and it's completely searchable. It will tell you, particularly if you're looking for research that you want to cite in a book, it'll provide you with the citations, any kind of restrictions on publication, like copyright issues, they will inform you. And it has a very extensive picture catalog that's extensive. What I wanted to show you was a photograph of Rockland in 1900, so you could see what it looked like here where we are today. But it's all free. They're all very helpful. If you're doing anything related to California history or culture, they have a separate section in the California State Library called the California History Room that has materials in stacks that you can actually access without going through the assistants there, the librarians. And they have an extensive millions of material that you can simply call up and they will bring it to you, and you can use it for your research. It's very extensive. See if we can make this work here. This is not cooperating at all. Doggone it.
I don't know if I can help you. I'm not a Mac person.
Well, I'm just not getting anything from the mouse here. So
It's not clicking on it.
it's not. There's no arrow. Because I got these all linked up to come up. So
I don't want to go mess you up here.
yeah, it's just not.
I'm not sure about that. I'll go see if I can find something.
Well, let's do a journey of imagination. Okay, and see what we can do here. But this is the Online Archive of California. I would urge you, if you're doing it, it's not just California-based, but it's primarily California-based. This is a linkage. This is online, and the addresses are all in the handout I gave you. That links up databases from the California State Library, university libraries, research think tanks, special collections, historical societies, museums throughout California. It's extraordinary. And all of the collections and databases by all the University of California campuses, all the state university systems. There's even materials, if Sierra College makes it available to the public, it's available too. It's amazing. And if you enter this something in this, it'll bring up not only specific items related to your search, but throughout the state, and in some cases nationwide, the collections that have the same material that you're looking for. And so you can go find, in somewhere else through additional research, you can find places that maybe have the only copy of a magazine article that you're looking for instance. It is a fabulous resource to find. And the same thing is true with the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress, bless their heart, sometimes the government does stuff that's pretty good. And one of the things they've done in the Library of Congress is they spent a lot of money over the last 20 years to expand their offerings and to make things available to you for free. So they have now millions upon millions from the largest library in the world, which is the Library of Congress, of source material, documentation, unbelievable photograph collection, and they will tell you if you can utilize it without any kind of fee, whether there's any copyright restrictions on any of this material, where it's available, how you can access it. It's an enormously helpful resource indeed. So if you look through these other resources and you don't find something, go to the Library of Congress, and chances are you're going to find something unique. What I wanted to show you, because this isn't working here, darn it, is since this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in all elections, I wanted to show you that there are over 150,000 entries dealing with the 19th Amendment. Not only the accounts of it, but also images of it, photographs, newspaper articles. It's extraordinary resource. Okay, here we go again. Let's see what happens now. This is a relatively new resource, but it's fabulous. It's absolutely amazing. It's called the California Digital Newspaper Collection. It's run by UC Riverside, in which they have, since 1848, collected digitized versions, microfilm essentially, of newspaper runs, entire newspaper runs, for hundreds of newspapers throughout California. And so they have in excess of 1.5 million pages right now, and it continues to grow exponentially. And you can go to any of these newspapers, enter a subject, a date, a publication, and it'll bring up the image of the newspaper. And then if you search it, it'll bring up articles dealing with that topic. You can clip the article, you can get just the text of it, or you can get an image of it so that you have verification of a detail that you're looking for. It's a remarkable resource. And I know a number of people that I know who are both write prose and fiction and nonfiction, use it extensively. And it's also very interesting if you're just looking for something, say you're interested in looking up something about the Summer of Love, say in 1967. You enter that, you'll come up with hundreds of articles that will deal with it, that will give you a sense of it, a cocoon that I was talking about before. There are other resources too that can provide you with information about resources for your research that can be helpful. One is called WorldCat. Anybody heard of WorldCat? This is a world catalog of books, and it's a listing of libraries that hold books. So I just, for the heck of it, I just put one of my books up there. I just wanted to see how many libraries hold this book, and the closest one to me, living in Loomis. And it shows you where this is. California State Library has a copy, and 50 some other libraries have it worldwide. My first book I ever did 20 years ago is in something like 700 libraries, including 10 of them in like Germany. Who'd know? I would know. I wouldn't know. But here you can find, if you're looking for a topic, and it'll go by topic as well, you can find in your local library whether they have it or not. and if it's not there, where you can go and find it. The resources are available. You just have to do a little bit of research. Sierra College Library is very, very good. They have, again, if I could click on this, I would show you a feature they have called the Discover feature. And the Discover feature is a linkage to databases like JSTOR and others, extensive databases, many databases, that if you enter an issue, you will find lots of material. When I was testing this earlier, I was just curious to see what they had about Greta Gerwig, who got she should have been nominated for an Oscar for Little Women, for directing that. She didn't. So I wanted to see what other people had thought about that. So I put in Greta Gerwig, 13,422 issues. Journal articles came up about Greta Gerwig should have got the Oscar. It's amazing. And from there, and what's great, this is for you who are students, if you're writing history papers or research papers for English classes or what else, this resource will give you the citation. And it's an APA and MLA and Chicago style. You have all these choices. It does the work for you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's a great resource. That's available to you as a student, and also to a limited extent for the public. And then there are resources that have to do with the actual publishing world itself, or with certain genres of writing. There's Poetry Magazine, which provides poems and prose and poet bios, book reviews. Randy, are you familiar with this? Yeah. Book reviews and essays. There's podcasts and directions to them that can give you, linkage to what poets are doing and how they do it and what's, being written about right now. There's Poets and Writers, which is more of an industry thing for markets, for contests, for grants, for gigs, for writing gigs and jobs. They have a quite extensive list of graduate programs, MFA programs, also a listing of agents. So the resources are there if you're looking for the nuts and bolts of the publishing world. It's there too. There's something called the Literary Marketplace, which is a directory of U.S. and Canada book publishing houses and industry news. And it has more than 30,000 listings of book publishers and some of their requirements for submissions, for instance. There's publishers and agents and sales reps and book binders and exporters and importers, book producers, people who produce the physical item, but also about industry news and trends, which can be useful if you're looking for a direction for your writing to go. There's literary magazines too that are online. This is the Literary Hub, which focuses on what they call the literary culture. So it's reviews and criticism and bookstores and libraries. They have a pretty interesting section on true crime books and who's doing what when it comes to true crime was very popular, of course. Also about nonprofits that deal with writing and publishing related works. Kind of the Bible of this stuff is Publishers Weekly, which goes into the book publishing and book selling news and which has extensive reviews for books, publishes bestseller lists. It's a industry news and job clearinghouse. It's really kind of the grande dame of publishing news. There are also, I want to point out, there are also online dictionaries in thesauri, is that right? Multiple thesauruses. If you're old school like me, you have your dog-eared Rogers and Websters. But if you want to use online dictionaries, they are available. What's particularly good about these is they're current. My old dictionary isn't, but newer terms or newer ideas and words are there. Many choices are available to you, and you can take a look and see what online dictionaries can provide you and find the one that you're most comfortable with if you choose to go that way. And the same thing is true with the thesauri. There's Roget's is there always, but there's many, many choices today. I just put the word research in, and many times it'll give you the ones that are considered most relevant, kind of color-coded by usefulness, which can be helpful as well. And these thesauri are much better than if you go to, when you're doing something on Word, Microsoft Word, for instance, and you go to the thesaurus there, they give you lots of choices, but it's not nearly as extensive. And so it can give you a lot more options. There are also books that deal with the sources that deal with the writer's life, too. Writer's Digest is particularly good. And they go into specifics having to do with the writer's life and also markets. Writer's Digest prints books as well, usually Writer's Market books on an annual basis or online. And what it does, usually once a year, is what this represents. They will list the 101 best websites for writers. And it will go into the specifics, some of the details of how to produce your work, writing techniques, writing ideas, publishers, research entities, people you can talk to, agents, bookbinders, the whole thing. One that I find particularly intriguing on this particular list, this is last year's list, is this one right here, the 6-word memoir. Have you heard of this? This is great. I mean, we all seek to be, as skillful in writing and use what one of the writing guides says, omit needless words. Just be simple. And the 6-word memoir is you tell the whole story, or a story, in 6 words. And the example they use here is attributed to Ernest Hemingway. And this is the story. This is a 6-word story. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. There's a story there in 6 words. It shows the power you can demonstrate if you choose your words wisely. It's really remarkable how you can make those 26 letters leap off the page and run across the field. There's also the Write Life, which is pretty good too, in terms of providing, not quite as good I think as the Writer's Digest, but very good in providing information about specific actions that writers can take. They also produce 100 best websites outlet, which is similar to what Writer's Digest has, but with different websites. So it's a good comparison to do so. So if you're looking for something that will help you with publishing, that'll help you with finding an agent or some of the publishing techniques and skills you need to have to navigate through the actual writing business, it's good. It's very good. There are lots of these websites, lots and lots of these websites. The list I have for you here is only a list of them, and sadly, because I couldn't make the thing work here, I can't demonstrate some of the examples of this. But it's extensive, it's easy to use, and it makes it possible for you to make your research practices much easier, much more comfortable. And then I put one more in there, and again, this isn't working sadly, that I just put in for fun. I use this all the time just to get myself kind of thinking about things and when I'm writing. This is from the United Kingdom. It's called Plot Generator, and it's mostly for fun. And so they have all these choices here in which they will help you if you want to write a fairy tale. They give you this list and you fill in the blanks and it writes a fairy tale for you. It's great. And then what I like in particular is the one that's opening line. And you click on that and it gives you 10 opening lines for whatever you're writing. And it's usually something about, there's one I saw this morning, it said, last year 736,000 people died, but only one of them deserved it. And if you're a fan of, I'm a fan of opening lines, you may be too, in books. Let me give you a couple examples. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Anybody know what that's from? Yeah, it's George Orwell. It's from 1984. And then this is my personal favorite, because I deal a lot with the West when I write, but this is from a novel. Let me make sure I get it out here right. When Augustus came out on the porch, the blue pigs were eating a rattlesnake, but not a very big one. That's Larry McMurtry. That's from Lonesome Dove. This gives you something to look at, something fun, because sometimes filling that blank page can be difficult. And sometimes you need to just take a little mental vacation, but still be in the ball game when it comes to writing. And this is kind of just a fun way to do it. I must tell you, I'm very disappointed that this didn't work, because I wanted to show you some of the examples of the things you can find with relative ease now. Things that before you would have to dig through volumes in the library. Now you can find them because they're available to you. As a result, this is a little shorter than it should be. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have now. Any things about pitfalls or problems? Yes?
My great-grandfather immigrated from Germany in 1868, and it fascinates me because, especially with a lot of the information or a lot of what's going on about immigration, and there were so many people that immigrated to this country, and what drove them to immigrate. And the other thing is, he came into this country, and I think the first place he settled was Illinois. He married his wife there, who came from Germany, but not at the same time, so why did she come? But then he became a Methodist circuit writer in the Midwest. He did that for several years in the 1800s, late 1800s, moved to Colorado for a while, moved to California, so I know some of the California information I could probably find through here. And actually, he was preaching at a Methodist church in Los Angeles, got up, gave his sermon, sat down, and died of a heart attack.
Wow.
So I'm thinking there's probably somewhere in some newspaper an obituary about him. And you know, a lot of the references you've given, but there again, it's going to be in different states too. So does
and there, you know, this is about primarily California focused because we're here.
Right.
But a lot of, in particular, recently, state libraries have made an extensive effort nationwide to try to take documentation that they've had, like diaries and journals and letters that have just been sitting in an archive someplace, and going through the effort of digitizing it. For instance, I'll give you an example. California State Library has thousands upon thousands of Gold Rush letters that have never been digitized or transcribed because they simply don't have the people or the money to do it. They're making a concerted effort to do that now and making it available to people. So things like what you're talking about, newspapers, journal entries, diaries, letters, throughout the nation are becoming much more available as a result of this. It wouldn't surprise me at all if your relative who died in California, if you went to the California Digital Newspaper Collection and entered his name, it wouldn't surprise me at all that something would come up. I mean, it's really quite remarkable what they have there. And often what it frequently does is it'll connect you to something else that may be kind of tangential, but which references the person or what the person was doing or the place they worked, and you can kind of reverse engineer it and get to where you want. It's great for genealogy, but it's great for writing too. If you're going to tell a personal memoir or family history, it's great. Works really, really well. Yes? The newspapers. It's called the California Digital Newspaper Collection. It's what's on the list of the resources I gave. Yes?
So this is just a follow-up. So if I'm writing a novel set in a town in Massachusetts and in Norman Rockwell's era, I would go to the Massachusetts State Library first? Do you think that's the best place
I would go to the
start?
Library of Congress.
Library of Congress first.
And go to the Library of Congress and see what they have. And the Library of Congress will give you collection information of places that hold material about that. And they'll point you in the direction of something. And also there might be a publication or a journal article that's dealt with that. And if you go to that journal article and get into their citations, it can point you in that direction. You reminded me of something, though, because somebody pointed this out to me a while ago, that there was a novel written about the Great Fire in London in 1666. You just reminded me about this because the guy wanted to get the context right. And he had this passage in the novel in which it was quite beautifully written, in which his friend, he was telling it from the personal story about his friend, and this was a merchant in London, and he had an image of the merchant silhouetted by the fire as his whole life was burning down in the Great Fire of London. And the guy said, "Yeah, this is pretty dramatic." They did the fact check, and they said, "No, you can't write that. You can write about the imagery, but you can't use the word silhouette, because the word silhouette didn't come about until the 18th century." That's the kind of thing you find. And if you get an editor, a fact checker that's thorough like that, it can make a difference in what the reader's expectations are. And we all make mistakes, but it's this kind of research can help in that regard. Yeah. So I would go to Library of Congress first. To me, that's my kind of default. When I can't find anything, if it's not California, I go there. Yes, ma'am.
These same lines, I'm writing the same kind of thing, family diaspora from Spain to Hawaii to California. And, I'll be writing along and she walked into the room and, did they have electricity? Did they have, would it have been coal? Would it be gas? Did they use candles? And I'll spend a day Googling up.
That's all?
When electricity, how can I give up, right? Electricity in rural Spain, 1906. Is there some place, and I apologize for coming in a little bit late, is there just some place to ask that specific question? When did they get electricity in rural Spain, 1906?
Oh, yeah, I think, yeah. You might find, to go to these resources, there might be something, particularly online now, that deals with Spanish history or something in that way that's relevant to it. It might be frustrating because sometimes you do this and you get nothing. Yeah. And you just, my sense is, I didn't mean to laugh at you when you said you take a day. I mean, I've worked on stuff for a month and found nothing. And you kind of have to alter your search and find out. You might go into what was life like in England at the time. There might be in England a reference to what life like was in continental Europe, and it'll point you in the right direction. You kind of have to go around the circuit to get to it. The thing is to be persistent, because you might go down ultimately a dead end, but you might find something very, very surprising and new, and that's what makes this whole process fascinating to me. I'll let you go.
If you go into a state, a lot of times the Historical Society will be online, and from that you can find old papers.
Yes.
And for architecture, because I'm in theater and design, sometimes you can look into a country and you can find out things about the castles, about the upper class, and feel that they'll compare it to the lower class.
Yeah.
And from there you can find out that way. That's kind of a back door into that.
Yeah, backdoor is a great way to put it, because if you go searching for one specific thing, you may not find it, but if you go to something that's on a tangent, it'll bring you back to it. So, I mean, you just have to stick with it. Yes, sir.
Would you elaborate on finding contradictory information when you're researching something?
Oh, yeah, sure. I just wrote a book on the gold rush. And the gold rush story that we all know is just filled with contradictions. And the errors that you find in the standard gold rush histories, even of the time, are just incredibly inaccurate. I'll give you an example. There's a famous letter that was written by a Chinese merchant in San Francisco during the gold rush, when the Chinese were starting to be discriminated against and there were purges and they were being booted out of around here in particular. Famous letter that's quoted over and over and over and over and over again in gold rush histories. Every single one of them spells his name wrong. and you go back to the original document, which is a newspaper article, it spelled it correctly. But somehow there was a typo, and that typo just kept going through. And so it happens a lot. But there are contradictions. This is particularly true when you get, I can only speak from a historical nonfiction because that's my primary thing, an event in which it's the same event, but the account of it, a first-hand account, is frequently different because someone's in a different place or a different time period or, was injured or something, whatever it may be. The problem you face in that circumstance is which one makes the most sense and which one is the most accurate. And that way you have to bolster it with something else. If there's other accounts that are more similar to one or the other, you go with that. But it's a kind of a crapshoot, and you never quite know whether it's accurate or not. And so you have to write it in such a way that says that, I don't want to be legalistic, but the preponderance of the evidence indicates that this is accurate. But it's a constant problem when you write history in particular. Very, very common. And it can be very frustrating as well. Yes, Dave.
Just to reinforce that, writing recently about Black Elk Speaks, John Neidhart is the author. This was written in 1932 or something like that. And John Neidhart from Nebraska, laureate, Caucasian, went to the Native American reservation, which interviewed a medicine man at Black Elk. And so through translation came up with this book. And I've always admired it. And so all I was doing was writing about how I admired this book. I Googled, when was it? 1932, something like that. But then underneath were all these different interpretations of it. And so since the Red Power movement, they say the translator had it wrong, that Black Elk was just pulling wool over his eyes. And so now I just wanted to mention this thing, admiring it a lot. And now I feel like I'm going to have footnotes of disclaimers that are 10 times more than what I was trying to do.
Yeah. Dave teaches history at Sierra College. That's my colleague. And so, yeah, that happens all the time. And kind of the get-to way of getting around it when you write now is to say that up until recently, the commonly felt belief was, but there are contradictory elements to it now, and you express that. This happens pretty frequently in which you have this factoid, but you have the factoid and then twice as much disclaimer. I mean, you have to do this. And so when you're writing, particularly when you're writing something that's a popular issue like World War II or the Gold Rush or something like that, you go with the most recent interpretation. And if your research provides something different, you explain that, you point that out. And it's just part of the whole writing process. But it changes, constantly revisionist in history. Yes?
Related to that, you do your best, you do all this research.
Sure.
The final pass, if you're traditionally published, would be the research editor. And then if you're self-publishing, are there people that you can hire that are fact checkers?
Yeah, no, they're fact checkers and historical researchers. In traditional publishing, I don't know if it's true in all publishing houses, but the one I go through, kind of the last line of defense is the copy editor. And usually it's vetted. My stuff is vetted by somebody who's an expert in the field. And then the copy editor goes through and points out where your syntax is making things unclear, or explain this, or you need more here, something like that. But no matter what, there's going to be errors. I encountered somebody a few years back who works for a publishing house in Hawaii, and they were telling me that there was a study, I've never been able to find this, but she claims it's true, that no matter how many eyes are on a manuscript, there's going to be a half a dozen typos. It's just going to happen. And the same thing happens in history where you don't explain yourself well, or it's not complete enough, and it leads to criticism, and justified criticism, that you weren't complete enough. And but it happens, and so you do the best you can. And to answer your question, yes, there are people privately you can hire. The only thing is, check their credentials, because there's people who claim to be experts and they're not. So. Any other questions you might have? I do apologize that this didn't work. I mean, there's some really cool stuff I wanted to show. Yes, sure.
And these are just kind of some examples. So I'm writing a story about a hospital back in Norman Rockwell time.
Uh-huh.
Let's say I can't really go to it and write it, but is something like that so minor that it really doesn't matter that much? But then
What? Give me an example.
like, okay, so Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I want to set something back in the 80s. And I just want to describe this character being in the hospital, walking through the wings. And so, obviously there'd probably be posters and ads or different things up on the wall that would be different than today.
Yeah.
And there would be, I don't know, like drinking fountain would be there. I probably wouldn't necessarily think of that today, because sometimes you got the water
No,
cooler
well,
or just like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would try to create as accurate a world as possible. As I mentioned before, you don't have to use it, but for your comfort zone when you're writing it, if you're comfortable that you are creating this image that conforms to the reality, you're finding it. You don't have to write about the drinking fountain, but if you know about it, it comes through in your writing, I believe. So I think it's valuable to do that. I think it's always valuable to over-research.
So I always feel like I have to try and go there and see what it looks like now and talk to people. So of all of these suggestions, in a case such as that, where would you start with that one?
Well, if you can, if it's physically possible to go someplace, it's always good to have that physical observation. But in some cases, you can. If you're writing, Lewis and Clark or something, you can go to some of the locations, but it's not going to be the same because it's 2 centuries later. You can get a feel for it, but you can also get a feel for that through other people's writings or through imagery. You can get a sense of it. You don't have to be an expert, but if you get to the point where you can demonstrate a working knowledge of it, you're good to go, I think.
I have one more example. These are just kind of like where to start out of all this information. So as an example, I have a character who is going to be traveling alone as a child in the 70s, which I know can be done because I did it.
Are we talking 1970s? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm looking to find the FAA policies or airline policies for children traveling alone in the 70s. So something like that, I just get stuck on, so of your suggestions, where would you start in that example?
Well, the first thing I would do is just Google it and see what you get. And if you don't get anything, then go to government websites. And, government websites are pretty extensive now, and they have documentation, and sometimes they can be kind of difficult to navigate because they're kind of counterintuitive, a lot of them. But you can get into that. If you get into FAA documentation, it wouldn't surprise me. But you also might find, through your research, again, a Library of Congress, because it's a government agency, you might find a direction toward a description of somebody, like a memoir, of somebody who was involved in that, who can give you some sense of what it was and point you in the right direction. I just find this when I do this, it's just a continual, it's like a trail. And you're just going along the trail and finding something new and an arrow that's pointing you in some other direction. And so just keep with it and keep looking. Alter your searches so that you're not just FAA, it might be airlines or airplanes or children or whatever it may be. Or lawsuit. Yeah, lawsuits are good. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad, Dave, you brought that up, because legal research can be very, very fruitful. And what's particularly good now is law books and court cases and legal decisions throughout the country are becoming much more accessible now. And so you can get information like on laws, statewide or nationally, much more easy to get now. Before you had to dig through legal libraries to get them. So, you know, just look and keep looking and see what comes up. Yes?
If all of these resources, which is fantastic that you shared, most of them you said are digitized, searchable. So if you Google up FAA laws in 1970s, why is she not getting, wouldn't it be hitting all of these sources?
Not necessarily, because it's very specific when you do a search, particularly for government, because you might put in FAA regulations, but it might be regulation 12345C in the Department of Interior or something. You know, again, the back door is the word you used. It's so good. It's probably there, but how you get to it, how you get the right key to open the door is where it becomes problematic. And this is where you get really frustrating. And you find this a lot. I find it a lot.
In this example, the other thing that's been hard to do, I did find a few little bits of information, nothing official, but it was talking about how lax sometimes the flight attendants were. In some cases, they would walk the child to the next gate, and in other cases, in my case once, I just got off the plane and went walking away. You know, I knew how to do that because I traveled a lot. But so then you have to think of humans, you know, did that really happen, or did they break those rules? Were those rules held, you know?
See, I would think, you know, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, but a fruitful avenue to search is to go to the Department of Transportation resources, or, you know, again, lawsuits or any kind of airline documentation, and see what comes up. And chances are something's going to push you in the right direction. Well, again, I wish I had been able to show you some of this cool stuff that's available online, but it just didn't cooperate. But thank you so much. I appreciate it. Hope this was helpful.